Draw your last pathetic card so I can end this, Yugi.
My grandpa's deck has no pathetic cards, Kaiba. But it does contain the unstoppable Exodia.
Yu-Gi-Oh! Is probably one of the most beloved shows from many of our childhoods. If you're like me, then seeing the duels take place on the show made you want to jump headfirst into the game yourself. So if you're interested in learning how to play the game of Yu-Gi-Oh!, then you've come to the right place. Yu-Gi-Oh! Can be an incredibly complex game with thousands of cards and different interactions, making it seem daunting for a new player to get into the game, but I'm here to show you that isn't necessarily the case. If you're new to the channel, my name is tcgsam, and I'm a small content creator that makes content on the competitive side of the game. I've been playing the card game ever since I was a kid, and I've been playing competitively for over 6 years now. In this video, I'll be showing you everything you need to know to start playing Yu-Gi-Oh! In the simplest way possible. Now, if you just need a refresher on certain topics or have played in the past, you can find the timestamps to the different sections I'll be covering in the description below and skip ahead to the relevant ones. Without any further ado, it's time for you to learn how to duel. Welcome everyone to YGO 101. Thank you all for coming today. I'm Professor TCGSam, and the purpose of this course is to teach you all how to play Yu-Gi-Oh! In the shortest time possible. Let's get started right away with what the game is. Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a two-player card game marketed towards those ages 6 and over, although you'll find that most people playing the game are actually adults with the reading comprehension abilities of a 6-year-old. The objective in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is to meet one of 3 win conditions: reducing your opponent's 8,000 life points to 0, decking your opponent out, or winning by resolving the effects of certain cards. Close to 100% of the games you play nowadays will be won by reducing your opponent's life points to 0, so I won't be covering the situations where the other 2 win conditions will occur. Now let's start with getting you familiarized with the basics of the game. I've taken some pictures out of an official Yu-Gi-Oh's beginner guide, as I find that they explain these concepts very well. I won't read off of the text in these pictures as they're quite long. Rather, I'll try to explain the parts that aren't necessarily clear or highlight the parts that are important. So please pause the video if you need more time to read the text on the screen. I'd recommend first pausing to read over the screenshots before listening to my explanation if you have no experience with Yu-Gi-Oh! At all, since they do a good job of explaining the concept in simple terms. I'll be following this format only for part 1 of the lesson, so don't worry, you won't have to do much reading in later sections. Anyways, in Yu-Gi-Oh! Both players begin with 8,000 life points, unlike the 2,000 or 4,000 you may have seen in the anime. You'll be facing off on a board that looks something like this. I'll explain what the zones on the board mean in more detail once you become more familiarized with the cards you'll be using in the game. For now, you need to know that the monsters are played in the monster zones, the spell and trap cards are played in the spell and trap zones, and cards go to the graveyard after they are used or destroyed. Every deck in Yu-Gi-Oh! Will be comprised of some combination of monsters, spells, and trap cards, so let's go over what they are. Monster cards are the key to winning your games, as they put out the necessary damage needed to reduce your opponent's life points down to 0. You'll notice that they have a text box at the bottom of each card that contains their special abilities if they are an effect monster like Link Slayer here, or it contains some lore about the monster that has no relevance to the game if it is like Blue Eyes White Dragon here. Even though there are a lot of different parts to a monster card, you'll find that most of the time, its level and its effect are going to be the things that you want to focus on while you're just starting out. In the future, you'll find that there are many cards that make use of the other parts of the monster cards. Now, how do you play your monster cards? Each player has access to 1 normal summon per turn, which consists of playing down the monster from your hand to the field in your main monster zone, either in face-up attack position or face-down defense position. Note that for monsters that are level 5 or 6, you will need to tribute 1 monster already on your field in order to normal summon it, and for level 7 or higher monsters, you will need to tribute 2 monsters to normal summon it. While normal summons were sufficient for the early days of Yu-Gi-Oh!, the real power of your monsters are typically achieved nowadays through special summoning. Any summon that isn't a normal summon is considered a special summon, and there are plenty of different types of summoning that you're going to learn about in just a bit. Before we get to the types of special summons though, let's talk about the other 2 types of cards you'll have access to, spells and traps. While each spell and trap card is played in the same way, there are many different types of spell and trap cards, which you'll see in a bit. You'll notice that each will have a symbol on the card that will show what type of spell and trap card it is, and this is found on the top right corner of a card. The only thing I'll mention in addition to what you've read on the screen is that you can set both spell and trap cards, so this opens up some opportunities to quote-unquote bluff your opponent into thinking you have a powerful trap card set, whereas in reality it is a harmless spell card that can't be used on their turn. Note that you can still activate spell cards after they have been set during that turn, and the only condition is that if you set a quick play spell, it cannot be activated until the next turn like a trap card. Now let's talk a bit about the phases of each turn. You'll find yourself most often making actions in the main phases and the battle phases, so try to focus on those now as a beginner, and worry about the other phases only if a card mentions them. As seen, you can summon or set monsters and play spell and trap cards in both the main phases. It's important to remember that in the battle phase, only quick play spell cards and trap cards can be played, so conduct all the summons and play the necessary spell cards before going into the battle phase. The other phases will usually only be considered if a card specifically mentions it. Battling in this game is how you deal damage to your opponent's life points and clear their monsters off the board. The picture you see explains all the possible scenarios of when your monster battles an opponent's monster. If your opponent has no monsters on the field, your monsters can attack directly and hit your opponent's life points, which will then be depleted by the full amount of your monster's attack. Positions for your monsters can also be swapped around as you see here, and you can flip summon face down monsters that were previously set. Some monsters even have special abilities when they are flipped face up, whether by you flip summoning them or having your opponent attack into them, like with Raiko here. Now that you're familiar with monster spells and trap cards, let's talk about the different types of monsters you'll come across in the game. The first of these monsters are ritual monsters, which are a part of the main deck. Like you see in front of you, you need to tribute monsters using a ritual spell card in order to summon the ritual monster from your hand. This is usually a very steep cost, and as such, you will typically not see these monsters be used in the modern game unless a more powerful ritual spell is able to cheat out a ritual monster for a lesser cost. The next of these monsters are fusion monsters, which are placed in your extra deck. You are allowed to have 15 cards in your extra deck when you start a match. Like your main deck, your opponent doesn't get to see these cards until you summon them, so keep them face down. The way you fusion summon is using a spell card to combine your monsters into a more powerful fusion monster. The most generic card to fusion summon with is Polymerization, which has the simple effect of using monsters from your hand or field that fulfill the requirements of the fusion monster in the extra deck. But there are monsters out there that can be summoned by more powerful fusion spells or even without a spell at all. But for now, consider fusion summoning as being limited to the fusion spell and the materials that you have. Next, we have Synchro monsters. There aren't too many gimmicks with this mechanic. It just requires you to have a tuner monster and non-tuner monster on the field to summon it straight from the extra deck. No other cards needed like fusion summoning or ritual summoning. Just make sure that the monsters you are using to synchro summon meet the summoning requirements of the synchro monster. And as you'll see, tuner monsters are specified in the card's text itself. Next are Xyz monsters. For this summoning mechanic, you just need to remember that the materials you use to summon it must be face up and be the same level. Remember that Xyz monsters don't have levels, rather they have ranks, so you cannot overlay an XYZ monster with a regular monster unless otherwise specified on the card. Otherwise, Xyz summoning and Xyz monsters are exactly as you see on the screen. Link summons are essentially like synchro summons, except instead of a tuner, the monsters you use must instead satisfy the summoning conditions on the link monster. This usually means that link monsters will be more accessible and easy to bring out than the other types of extra deck monsters. In the past, these were a requirement to open up your main monster zones for your extra deck monsters, but now they're not as necessary as before, which we'll get into a little bit later. Using other link monsters as material to summon a new link monster can be very powerful, as you might have read already. Just remember that they can only count as either one link material like a regular monster, or count as X materials exactly, where X is the link rating of the monster. This is important to remember since you can't overshoot the requirements for a link summon. For example, you can't use 4 regular effect monsters to link summon Deco Talker since it only needs 3 link materials. Next up are Pendulum monsters, perhaps one of the most complicated monsters in the game according to some. Pendulum monsters are essentially spell cards in the Pendulum zones and are monster cards in a monster zone. Pendulums and link monsters also need to adhere to the extra monster zone restrictions at the time of recording this video, so keep that in mind if you are summoning them back from the extra deck. Otherwise, you can pendulum summon up to 5 or 6 monsters from your hand to your main monster zone. Also remember that you can only pendulum summon once during your turn, despite it being a special summon. Now that you're familiar with all the types of cards you have access to, let's get to deck building. You can have up to 3 copies of any given card with a certain name in your deck and extra deck, as long as they abide by a forbidden and limited list, which I'll get into more depth later. Your main deck can consist of anywhere from 40 to 60 cards, and your extra deck can consist up to 15 cards. If you plan to play matches, you will also be able to construct a 15 card side deck which you can use to swap cards out from your main and extra deck in between games. The final section I want to go over is the Master Rule in Yu-Gi-Oh! This determines the set of rules that we play by. The Master Rule we're currently using at the time of the recording is Master Rule 5, which is subject to change in the future. Master Rule 5 essentially states that Link monsters and Pendulum monsters that would be summoned from the extra deck can only be special summoned to the extra monster zone or a zone a Link monster already points to. Synchro, Fusion, and XZ summoned monsters from the extra deck do not have to be summoned in the extra monster zone or a zone a Link monster points to, although you can still summon them to these zones if you wish. On the game board, it also states that the two outermost zones of your spell and trap card zones are where you can place your Pendulum cards as scales, or spell cards in this case. Otherwise, they function as regular spell and trap zones. You're ready to start dueling, but now that you've gotten the basics down, we're going to move on to some of the more advanced things you probably want to know. But before that, I just want to ask you to please subscribe if you haven't already. Only 12% of my viewers are actually subscribed to the channel. This is probably the most time I've ever put into one of my videos, so if you enjoyed it or learned something from it, I ask that you please take the time to click that subscribe button so I know that you're interested in seeing more content. So thank you, and now let's return to the video. The next part of this lecture assumes you already know the basics of the game, so if there's something you don't understand, then refer back to the previous section for clarification. Let's begin this section with a term you'll be coming across very often, that being activating a card. Like you see on the screen here, this is the term that is used to describe the action of playing a spell or trap card or using a monster effects. However, where it gets more complicated is the timing that you're able to activate these effects. I'll show you what I mean. There are three types of monster effects you should be familiar with: ignition, trigger, and quick effects. Aside from quick effects, the type of effect won't be specified on the card, so you have to look for certain keywords or phrases. For example, for an ignition effect, wording that doesn't specify a certain timing, like once per turn, do blank, means that it's an effect that you can use during the main phase. For example, this effect is found on the card Time Wizard, which has the once per turn clause at the start, where you can see here that says once per turn. Non-quick play spells aren't exactly ignition effects, but you can think of them as such to keep it simple. Next, we have trigger effects. The wording on these types of effects are usually along the lines of if or when this card is blank, where blank is some condition that must be met. For example, on Elemental Hero Stratos, we can see that its effect will activate only when it's successfully normal or special summoned. Another, more reactive example perhaps would be on Misjudge, whose effect would only be able to activate when your opponent activates a card. Some reactive trap cards will also have similar wordings and thus can only be used when the condition on them has been met. Once again, these aren't exactly trigger effects for the most part, but you can think of them as such to keep things simple. Finally, we have quick effects. These will usually be explicitly specified on modern cards, but older cards will have wording like during either player's turn, or during either player's blank, where blank is a phase. These effects can be used at any time, making them incredibly powerful. For example, Abyss Dweller's effect to prevent all effects in the graveyard can be used at any time, making it a powerful tool to disrupt your opponent even on their turn. You can think of quick play spells and most trap cards as quick effects in terms of when they can be used. In terms of when you get to use these effects, the player whose turn it currently is always gets priority to activate their quick effects first before their opponent gets to. On that note, let's talk about using cards simultaneously or in response to one another, referred to as chaining. Chain links are formed when cards are activated either simultaneously or in response to one another. Let's see how this is done through a simple example. If I activate my Elemental Hero Stratos' effect when I normal summon it, and my opponent activates their Effect Veiler's ability in response to Stratos' effect, a chain is created. The effects that are used first go lower on the chain link, so my Stratos' effect will be chain link 1, whereas the Effect Veiler will be chain link 2. In Yu-Gi-Oh!, chains resolve backwards, meaning cards with a higher chain link resolve their effects first. In this case, Effect Veiler resolves first, meaning my Stratos' effect is negated by the time we get to chain link 1. As a result, I can't get its effect to add a hero monster from my deck to my hand. This concept is called simultaneous effects go on chain, or SIGOC for short. Where it gets a little bit more complicated is when we begin to consider spell speeds, which determines the priority that cards have when they begin to get activated. So for spell speed 1 cards, these are card effects that can only be activated at the beginning of a chain. You cannot chain these card effects to other card effects. So things like normal, field, continuous, equip, and ritual spell cards, as well as flip, ignition, and trigger monster effects are also spell speed 1. Ignition-like and trigger-like spell effects are also spell speed 1. The only exception to this would be if multiple trigger effects happen simultaneously, then those effects would go on chain. Next are spell speed 2. These are card effects that can be activated at the beginning of a chain, but can also be activated in response to spell speed 1 and spell speed 2 effects, forming a chain. Quick way spells, normal, and continuous traps, as well as quick effects on monster cards, and trap effects that don't have conditions that need to be met are all spell speed 2. And finally, spell speed 3. These are card effects that can only be activated in response to something happening. You can only respond with spell speed 3 cards after spell speed 1 or 2 cards are activated in the same chain. The only cards currently in the game that are spell speed 3 cards are counter trap cards. Spell speed 3 cards can only be responded to with other spell speed 3 cards. You won't be seeing these specific spell speeds on the card itself, so you have to look out for the specific wording on the card once again. So if we take a look at the previous example, my Stratos' effect was spell speed 1, and Effect Veiler from my opponent was spell speed 2. If I had the counter trap Solemn Strike previously set on my field, I could use that in response to Effect Veiler since Solemn Strike is a spell speed 3 card. Now if my opponent had a second Effect Veiler, they could not use this effect in response to Solemn Strike since they would not be able to respond to the spell speed 3 of my Solemn Strike since it is spell speed 2 card. Now let's move on to the types of effects you'll be coming across. There's important wording within cards that tell you how many times you can actually use that card's effect per turn. Let's start with the most restrictive wording, like the one we see on Spellbook of Secrets. These explicitly state that you can only activate one of them per turn, or only use its effect once per turn. Similarly with the monster effects, they will explicitly say that you can only use the effect of that monster's name once per turn, meaning no matter what, you can only use it once. Next, cards like Time Wizard that say once per turn on them and don't have the explicit wording are considered soft once per turns. These can only be used once per turn per copy of the card. So for example, if you have multiple Time Wizards, or you remove your one Time Wizard from the field and bring back that copy later on, you can use this effect again since they would be considered different cards or a new copy of the card. Finally, cards with no restrictions in how many times they can be used simply lack the once per turn clause anywhere on them, like Catapult Turtle. These effects can be used as many times as you want during the turn. Some cards will also have a cost that needs to be paid before using it. These will be denoted by a semicolon on the card. For example, with Twin Twisters, the semicolon appears after the words discard one card and target up to 2 spell and trap cards on the field, which means that is the cost of the card and must be performed before resolving its effect. Once the cost of the card is paid and there's nothing to stop it, it will resolve the second part of the card, which in this case is to destroy the targeted cards. It's important to note that if your opponent stops the Twin Twister somehow, you still need to pay the cost of discarding a card and targeting 2 spell and trap cards on the field. On the other hand, effects are denoted by a colon or lack of any punctuation like a semicolon, like on Graceful Charity. This card has no cost associated with it, so if your opponent stops it somehow, you do not need to do any discarding and you don't get any drawing. The distinction between cost and effects are also important when it comes to cards that say something along the lines of if or when this card is discarded or sent to the graveyard by a card effect, like on Shaddoll Beast. Shaddoll Beast will not get its effect to draw if it was discarded by Twin Twisters, since its cost is not considered an effect. It would only get its effect to draw if it were successfully discarded by a card effect like Graceful Charity. Also remember that if a cost cannot be paid successfully, you cannot attempt to activate the card. For example, if a card requires you to send a card to the graveyard as cost, but there is a card preventing cards from being sent to the graveyard present on the field, then you cannot use the card whose cost is to send a card to the graveyard. On that note, you will also come across some special unintuitive interactions between certain cards that I can't cover in this video, but these are not necessary to remember unless your deck facilitates those interactions often, or you play against a deck that does. I suggest asking online on Facebook groups or watching ruling videos on YouTube for further explanation if you're confused, since there are dedicated communities out there who are willing to answer questions. Not only that, but these rulings change from time to time as well, and it's important to keep up to date with them. However, keep in mind that if you're going to a larger tournament, the head judge there will have the final say on how their particular interaction works. And these rulings may also change officially from time to time if Konami decides it's necessary, and they will make an announcement about it if it does. If you made it this far, you now have all the knowledge you need to play your first match of Yu-Gi-Oh! It's a lot to take in, I know. Most of the time, games you play with your friends or casually online will not be so complex and include all the scenarios that we discussed earlier on. But if you want to take it one step further than just playing casually with friends, then this section is for you. I'll be sharing how you can prepare for your first tournament based on my own experiences with competitive play. First and foremost, you must ensure that your deck abides by the Forbidden and Limited list, which you can find online on the official Yu-Gi-Oh! Website. So this list changes every few months or so, and all normal tournaments sanctioned by Konami use this Forbidden list. This ensures that your deck is legal to play in a tournament, and the goal of this list is to keep the game as balanced as possible, although you'll find that sometimes this is not the case. Games are also played as a best 2 out of 3 in the trading card game, unlike the online simulator Master Duel, which you may have heard of. This means you'll want to have a 15 card side deck as well to prepare counters to the certain decks you may face. Now, before going to a tournament, I recommend getting sleeves for your cards, specifically Japanese sized, since Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards are smaller than standard ones. These will not only protect your cards from getting damaged, but are also important to prevent any cheating, since all cards will have the exact same back and be indistinguishable from one another. This means that the Blue Eyes White Dragon you've had that has gone through the washing machine a couple of times wouldn't be playable unless you couldn't differentiate it from the other cards in your deck while it's in a sleeve. You'll also be expected to shuffle your opponent's deck before a game, and presenting your own deck for shuffling after going through it during the game, so sleeves can protect your cards from constant wear and tear. You'll also want to get a deck box to hold your cards, a way to keep track of life points either through calculator or the Yu-Gi-Oh! Neuron app, a dice and coin to decide who goes first, and bring a way to pay for the entry fee for the tournament. You may also find that it's beneficial to buy a binder to store your more valuable cards if you plan to get any, or use a box or tin to store bulk cards you may get from your entry pricing. Now, once you're in the actual tournament, they are usually played as a Swiss format, which means you'll play against others with a similar win-loss record as you. This means that even if you lose, you can still continue playing. Some tournaments will also have a top 4 or top 8 playoffs for the highest ranking players after the Swiss rounds to duke it out for first place. So even if you lose a couple of times during the Swiss rounds, you may still be able to make it to playoffs and ultimately win the tournament. Most tournaments will also have an entry prize for all participants and award extra prizes to top finishers. Now, at the time of recording, the end of match procedures are as follows. These are enacted every time you go past the 40-minute time limit in a round. So like I mentioned, you have 40 minutes to play out a round with up to 3 minutes of side decking in between games, although usually it doesn't take that long. If a winner is not determined by the end of the 40 minutes, the game continues only until the end of the current phase for the turn player. At the end of the phase, you check the life points of both players. If they are equal, then the game is a draw. If not, the player with higher life points wins that game. Based on the results of previous games, a winner is then determined. There are slightly different end of match procedures for elimination style tournaments and playoffs, but those are generally far and few between, so you can ask around those around you for clarification on them if needed. These end of match procedures lead to life manipulating cards that normally wouldn't be very good, like the ones you see on your right, being played in most decks to try to cheese out a win if their game reaches a time limit. Just a note, it's generally frowned upon to purposely try to take a game into the end of match procedures to win with one of these cards, and can even be illegal in some cases if the stalling was done intentionally. So, moral of the story, don't use this as a win condition, but be aware that it exists, and there will be times where you may need to win through these means since your game just naturally took that long. I think that generally wraps it up for all you need to know before your first tournament, but if you have any specific questions, then please let me know in the comments below and I'd be happy to answer them. In the final section of this lesson, I want to cover some very general tips and tricks for players that I wish I knew when I first started out. Whether you just learned how to play Yu-Gi-Oh! Or have been playing for a long time, there's something for everyone here. Let's start with deciding on what deck you should play and what cards to use within your deck. Of course, you can always play your favorite decks, and whether or not they're good, as long as you have fun, that's the important part. But if you're trying to play competitively and aren't sure what deck to play, then consider checking out some creators on YouTube, like my favorite YouTuber, tcgsam, who uploads consistently competitive content showcasing not only the best decks out there, but also rogue options that you can consider. Shameless plug aside though, YouTube is the best place to see what decks are winning large tournaments and hearing the explanations from the players themselves to get a better idea of what works in the meta and what doesn't. One day, you may even end up on YouTube yourself after winning a large tournament. Next, probably the most important piece of advice that I'm going to give today is to buy single cards to build your decks, not sealed products. Not only is this cheaper, but it's also much easier to do with TCG Player and eBay. Anyways, don't gamble on trying to get the cards you need. It'll only end up hurting you in the long run, since I'm speaking from experience. The amount of sealed product you need to open to even have a decent chance of getting all the cards you need is just way too much and not worth it in the long run. Speaking from experience, you'll need to also remember that sometimes you will get lucky or unlucky in your games. Variance is just a part of the game and completely out of your control, so you need to move past those times where your opponent had that perfect hand to beat yours, or when you drew the one card in your deck that could save you. Instead, focus on what you can control, that being your own technical play. If you lost the game to variance, you'll likely end up making up for it in the future by winning a game because variance favored you that day. But that's all I got for you guys today. If you guys enjoyed the video or have any questions, then please do let me know in the comments below and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. I know that I definitely couldn't cover everything there was to know about Yu-Gi-Oh! In one video, so if you think I missed something important or feel that some things weren't explained clearly enough, then please feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks again so much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one. Class is dismissed.